So
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this late Wednesday afternoon's FedFest live lounge session. Just to check that you're in the right place, I'm just going to share my screen, and I hope that you've joined us with the expectation that we're going to be talking about the risk of rebound, REM sleep, and the mental health continuum. My name's Ezra Hewing. I'm head of education at Suffolk Mind. I recognise a couple of names on the call, so I think our paths may have crossed before. If we haven't met before, it's lovely that you could join us. I'm going to kind of give you a bit of a summary of what I'm going to be sharing with you over the next hour and a half or so, and I also have a couple of questions for you to answer in the chat too. We're going to be looking at the connection between the mental health continuum, which is an idea that I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with, but if you're not, that's okay. We'll revisit and unpack it a little bit, and its connection with a particular kind of sleep called REM sleep. Again, I'm sure many of you have heard of REM sleep before, and what that means with regard to the way that we think about mental health in general, and also opportunities to support people that may be experiencing mental ill health, supporting ourselves, and possibly early intervention too. But before I get into that, if you're thinking about the work that you do, whether you're supporting other people, looking after yourself, or providing services, do you routinely ask them about sleep, the quality of the sleep, and how much they're getting? You might do, or B, sometimes, but only if the person brings up their sleep or lack of it. Or C, never ask about sleep, and that's okay. C is okay to pop in the chat too. So A, B, or C in the chat. I'll give you a moment or so to do that before Sarah breaks the news to me.
we've got a lot more B's than A at the moment. No
Okay.
C's.
No C's. All right. Okay. So people are genuinely asking about sleep, but and as you say, it's sometimes when it comes up, and a few A's, a few people are sort of routinely asking about sleep. That's very interesting. And then Kerry says, A, personal life. I never think about quality, just quantity. Yes, that's a lot. Thank you for sharing that, Kerry, and for being honest, because very often we tend to think about it in terms of quantity rather than quality of sleep. So that is super normal. Okay, I'll go back to showing my slides in a moment. Okay, so if we've worked together before, you'll know that I have a tendency to I think there's a lot of value in what you might call organizing ideas or frameworks that enable us to think about mental health more clearly. And I'm very interested in the relationships between different frameworks and how they overlap and how they can give us a bigger picture and also capture some of the details about mental health. And one idea for thinking about mental health that, as I said before, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is the idea that mental health is a continuum or a spectrum. Or if I was speaking to children in a primary school, I'd probably describe it as a line, because that's plainer English, and I'm trying to avoid jargon as much as possible. But if the mental health continuum is new to you, how it differs from traditional ways of thinking about mental health is that it focuses less on individual labels. So if you were thinking about mental health through a traditional medical model lens, you might think about something like anxiety, where, if a GP or a psychiatrist is going to diagnose somebody with an anxiety disorder of some kind or another, they'd have to meet a certain number of criteria that would be very specific, and they'd have to be experiencing the symptoms under those criteria for a particular length of time. And the same would be true of depression or post-traumatic stress disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder or whatever it might be. And if we're thinking about mental health in that way, it can kind of trick us into thinking that labels are kind of boxes, and that can get in the way or shape the way that we see people. Sometimes we can lose people because we're just focused on the label. Now, I'm sure that many of you think about mental health in that way already and are kind of cautious about the values and limitations of labels. But I just want to share this quote with you, which I think captures it very well, but also comes from a surprising place. So here's this quote: "Scientific evidence now places many, if not most, disorders on a spectrum with closely related disorders that have shared symptoms, shared genetic and environmental risk factors, and possibly shared neural substrates. In short, we have come to recognize that the boundaries between disorders are more porous than originally perceived." So in other words, things are much more fluid and they're not quite so fixed and rigid. And would you believe it? But that comes from the DSM-5, which is the kind of manual for diagnosing people and deciding which label should be attributed to them. And that's in the introduction on page 5. So even the people that, develop, test, and prescribe diagnostic labels recognize that mental health doesn't really work in that way, that it's much more fluid. And that's where the mental health continuum comes in, really, because one way of presenting the mental health continuum is that, as I said, it's a spectrum or a line that runs from a state of well-being at one end right the way through to severe mental ill health at the other end of that line. And then there's a crossover point, which is stress, which carries us from well-being and takes us a step down the mental health continuum. And if stress is unaddressed for a period of time, or if it's very severe exposure to stress, it can give rise to anxiety, worry, and begin to interfere with our sleep and cause us insomnia. And then as we're moving down the mental health continuum, we might be thinking about depression, low mood, exhaustion, loss of motivation, and so on. And then further down that line, the symptoms of other conditions. Now, thinking about mental health in this way helps us to see a number of things, which I think it's important to remember. And it's only by stepping away from thinking about mental health in terms of boxes and seeing it as a continuum that new insights emerge. And the first of those insights is that we're all on the mental health continuum. Everybody on this call and everybody who's not on this call is somewhere at any given moment between a state of well-being and the more severe end of the mental health continuum. And the second major insight is that isn't revealed when we think about mental health in terms of diagnostic labels, is that mental health is fluid. Symptoms come and go. And that gives us reason to be optimistic, because it leads to the next point, which is that recovery is the most likely outcome of somebody moving down the mental health continuum, but to the degree that they can be supported, or if they're able to make changes themselves, they're better able to meet needs. And I don't want to at all diminish the experiences of people who really struggle with what we might think of as symptoms at the severe end of the mental health continuum. But even for those people, their symptoms will fluctuate. They're not, it's not fixed and rigid in the way that labels suggest. And then a really important insight is that stress isn't random. It's nature's way of telling us that one or more of our needs are unmet, and they require some attention to do something about that if we can. Okay, so that's the mental health continuum. Before I launch into sleep, which I'm obsessed by, I'm going to ask if there are any questions, and I'll just stop sharing for a moment and ask you to pop any questions in the chat or the Q&A function. Let's give you a moment to do that. Might make it a little bit easier for you. Oh, no questions, but love that way of explaining stress as our body's way of letting us know our needs aren't being met. I think so too, Kerry. I think that's a really useful insight. If you like, if you don't have a question, you can just say, type in new idea, or you can say familiar with that, or however you want to phrase it, if that was something that you're already familiar with and is one way that you have come across to think about mental health. Okay, nothing at the moment, Sarah. So I think I'll move on and maybe come back a bit later on. Okay. So REM sleep. So I remember maybe 15 years ago or so when I was first giving presentations to people in workplaces. Before that, I'd just been working either in mental health services or in young offenders institutes and prisons. But I remember the very first time I stood up in front of a room of managers, and we were talking about ways to support people with their mental health and talking about needs. I remember asking about 30 or so people if any of them had heard of REM sleep before. It was like maybe one person at the back of that room. And things have changed quite dramatically. Nowadays, most people have heard of REM sleep, usually because they had Fitbits early on, or they had tracking devices of one kind or another. So more and more people have heard of it. It's more unusual to meet people who've not heard of REM sleep. Most of them will know that REM stands for rapid eye movement. A few people will know that we discovered rapid eye movement sleep, or it was discovered. We didn't do it unless we were born then, and unless the researchers are on the call, Asarinsky and Kleitman. It was discovered in 1953 by two researchers waking people up in a laboratory at the University of Chicago, and they discovered that most of our dreams occur during REM sleep, and further investigations show that there's an awful lot of activity going on in the brain during REM sleep, as compared to other phases of sleep, in particular deep sleep, when there's less activity. So if we just speak about two particular phases of sleep just for the moment. First of all, deep sleep. So deep sleep is where much of the brain is offline. In particular, if you put your hands on your forehead, and just above your eyebrows and up to, say, the center of your head, the orbital and prefrontal cortex is mostly kind of offline or in a resting state. And if somebody were taking brainwave readings of us when we're in a phase of deep sleep, they would record slow wave, low amplitude kind of electrical activity, at least if they were using an EEG. And what we know about deep sleep is that it's critical for things like repair of the body and the brain cells. It's also when those cells are repaired and formed, they also contribute to memory formation. And that if we don't get enough deep sleep, then, and the body can't repair itself, then we're vulnerable to physical inflammation, fatigue, and brain fog as well. And it can contribute to other conditions where inflammation is a feature. Now, there are other stages of sleep between deep sleep and REM sleep, but we'll just focus on these two for the time being. What we know about REM sleep is that there's a lot of activity going on. So if you take the same kind of EEG brainwave measurements, REM sleep looks a lot like waking states because there's a lot of electrochemical activity going on, lots of spiking of brainwaves, and it uses lots of glucose energy. We'll come back to that point shortly because it's really important for understanding the relationship between REM sleep and depression. While there are some dreams that do occur outside of REM sleep, most of our complex dreaming takes place during REM sleep. And if we look at the work of a researcher who started before the discovery of REM sleep, it was just focused on researching dreams, but continued his work for a few decades. And then the people that have built on Calvin Hall's work tens of thousands of case studies show that the emotions that we recall and experience during dreaming, when we recall them, and the metaphors of our dreams match our waking concerns. And I'll share some case studies with you which illustrate that a little bit later on. There are lots of competing theories about the function of REM sleep, but if we're thinking about REM sleep within the context of mental health, a really key and important insight is that REM sleep is involved in deactivating emotions that we don't act on. If you deprive people of REM sleep in laboratory settings, then the brain's amygdala, the amygdala, the brain security officers, are more reactive the following day, and people are more likely to have angry outbursts or experience anxiety or whatever it is. So loss of REM sleep leaves emotions active. If we don't have enough REM sleep, those emotions which are activated during the day to motivate us to address unmet needs, they don't get activated, and then they carry over to the next waking phase. Okay, so if we were thinking about different kinds of sleep cycles, so this is roughly what a healthy sleep cycle looks like, and I'm stereotyping slightly because it will vary from person to person, but the average adult will kind of dip down into, when they drift off to sleep, maybe there are kind of some simple dreams which kind of reflect what they were thinking about before they fell asleep, and then over a 90-minute period they'll go down and they'll have their first long phase of deep sleep, and then they'll come back after 90 minutes, come back up and have a phase of REM sleep for about 10 minutes or so, and then go down again for another longer period of deep sleep. Those are the big blue blocks, and you'll notice that most of them take place in the front half of the night. So we need deep sleep in the front half of the night to repair the body's cells and to keep us mentally and physically healthy. And then REM sleep phases increase in frequency and duration in the second half of the night, so that in the average night of, say, 7.5 hours sleep, if we're lucky, apologies to anybody on the call that doesn't get 7.5 hours sleep. There are many people that don't, and you're perfectly normal in today's, with today's demands and in the culture that we're living in. But in a healthy sleep cycle, or a healthy night's sleep, we'll have about an hour and a half of REM sleep in total, kind of broken up into episodes throughout the course of the night, and about an hour and a half of deep sleep, repairing the body's cells. And then the rest of it is made up of phases of sleep in between REM sleep and deep sleep that have other kinds of functions. Some of them are to do with learning and so on. So that's what a healthy sleep cycle looks like. But if we were looking at sleep and depression, then it looks very different. It might look something a bit like this. Somebody maybe is worrying about things which are concerning them during the day, or things that they've been dwelling upon, and that means that it's more difficult for them to go off to sleep. They might have a longer period of time to get to sleep, and then initially, when they do fall asleep, they're kind of having dreams about their waking concerns. They then go down and they may have a short episode of deep sleep before coming up much earlier, sooner than 90 minutes, maybe as soon as 50 minutes or an hour, for a longer and more intense period of REM sleep before they go back down again for a short interval of deep sleep, come back up for more REM sleep. If their dreams are particularly intense or characterized by nightmares, and maybe they wake up feeling anxious, lay awake for a while, struggle to go back off to sleep, and then again in the second half of the night, longer periods of REM sleep. And so less than the 1.5 hours deep sleep we need to wake up feeling physically refreshed. So the person's likely to wake up feeling exhausted physically, but also if somebody's experiencing depression, in about 80% of cases, what we call diurnal depression, where people feel worse first thing in the morning, what we see is that they will have anything from 2 to 4 hours REM sleep over the course of the night. And there are consequences for that too. So in summary, where we see this pattern of REM sleep in depression, and we've known about its existence since the early 70s, by the way, researchers in Italy discovered this. We know that REM sleep will start earlier on in the night and that it will last for longer periods of time, is more intense in terms of electrochemical activity and the bizarreness of people's dreams, that it burns huge amounts of glucose energy, and saps people's motivation. So they'll often wake up exhausted, lacking in motivation to get going, struggling, even to get out of bed. And if you've experienced depression, then maybe you'll know exactly what that feels like. We also know from those studies in Italy that if people in laboratories who are suffering with depression, if they're deprived of REM sleep, so in other words, if they're rigged up to machines that read when they've gone into REM sleep, and if you then wake them up to stop them from dreaming excessively, the symptoms of depression lift. So the low mood, the loss of motivation, the exhaustion, all of that lifts because they're not dreaming so much. Problem with that is it's not really a solution, because if they then leave the laboratory, then REM sleep kicks back in and they begin to experience the same pattern that we just saw, where REM sleep starts earlier on, lasts for longer periods of time, is more intense, burns off lots of energy, and saps the person's motivation to even begin to get out of bed, let alone address any of the worries and concerns that may have been contributing to their depression in the first place. Okay, I'll pause there and invite questions or comments or observations in the chat. I've already got one from Heather. Does this mean napping actually makes you more tired? That's a really good question. So napping can be useful if we're tired during the day, but it can have unintended consequences. So if somebody's asking me about napping, usually, assuming they're not working shift patterns, but if they have a regular kind of, trying to sleep at night and awake during the day, avoid napping after 3 o'clock. And the reason is that it reduces sleep drive. And what I mean by that is it reduces the appetite for sleep, so it can then make it more difficult to go off to sleep in the evening. So if that's what's happening for you, then I would avoid napping. If during napping you're just having like a long intense burst of REM sleep and it's burning off lots of the brain's energy, or if you wake up tired, it's probably because it's burning off lots of the brain's energy, and so it's probably not very helpful. Okay, Sarah agreeing with Heather, sometimes feel even more tired after a nap. That suggests that it's probably too much REM sleep that you're having while you're napping, and it depends on the length of the nap too. And then Christine asks, is there any relation to time of falling asleep and cycle, i.e. if you go to bed at 2 a.m., does this make any difference versus going to bed at 10 p.m.? Really good question, and the answer is yes, because it affects it will affect our body clock. We'll have different body clocks for different reasons. So from one person to another, one person may have the kind of body clock where they go off to sleep really easily at say 10:30, and then they kind of sleep through, wake up at 6, and they're an early riser. Somebody, a teenagers, for example, won't feel sleepy until say 11, maybe midnight, and then they'll want to sleep in longer the next day. And our school system's not really caught up with that at the moment. So that's really difficult for teenagers. They need more sleep and they'll feel sleepy at different times, and they need that sleep to support brain development and to deal with different difficult emotions that they're going through. Some people maintain that kind of pattern into adulthood where they won't feel sleepy until later on in the evening, and then they'll want to sleep in the morning. And on average, and this is a median average, women need a bit more sleep than men, and they maybe need to sleep in longer in the day. Again, that may change depending on the time of life and so on. We'll come back, but Christine, it's a really important question, and I want to come back to what we can do about supporting sleep cycles and the importance of regular getting up and going to bed times with interventions. Heather asks, I have a friend who has depression and basically always feel he has to nap as soon as work ends for him at 5:30. Yeah, I mean, so usually our body clock's rhythm, sometimes called a circadian rhythm, will make us feel sleepy every 3 hours or so. So now is a terrible time for me to be delivering a session and expecting you all to concentrate, because it's that kind of post-lunch, if we're in the in the Mediterranean, it would be natural to have a nap around about 2:30. So some of you might feel your eyes glazing over at one point or another. And then a couple of hours later on, say 5:30, 6 o'clock, someone's been spent all day concentrating on work, it would be quite natural for them to feel the need to nap, especially if their brain's exhausted, because during the night they're spending too much time in REM sleep and it's burning off lots of energy. Kerry says we might come onto this, and this might be a silly question. No such thing as silly questions. But is there anything people can do to improve the type of sleep they get? That they get the right combination of REM sleep, etc. It's the most important question, and we'll come onto that with interventions, Kerry. So thank you for asking that. Okay, I think I'll go back to my slides now to move on to the next bit, and I hope that what I've covered so far makes sense for you. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is something called REM sleep rebound. And REM sleep rebound is really the key to understanding the relationship between the mental health continuum and REM sleep and seeing how they connect up. So let's say we're losing REM sleep and we're losing it to stress that's causing us insomnia, or maybe it's a hypermanic or manic phase, the kind of thing that you might associate with bipolar. Or it could be that we're taking drugs which block REM sleep, and that could include prescribed medication like SSRIs or SNRIs or other drugs which act upon serotonin. Equally, it could be depressant substances like cannabis, alcohol, opiate-based painkillers, heroin, that kind of a thing. All of those will block REM sleep. So if we lose REM sleep, whether it's to stress or insomnia or substances, whatever it might be, after a few days or a week, and again, depending upon the individual, the brain will say, right, we haven't had enough REM sleep. We've got lots of emotions that have not been discharged, too much anxiety. We need to prioritize REM sleep. And then it will trigger a REM sleep rebound. And when a REM sleep rebound is triggered, we then see that pattern that we saw before with depression, where REM sleep then starts earlier on in the night. So instead of 90 minutes, after an hour of sleep, REM sleep will start. Those episodes will last longer and more intense, and they burn off more energy. So that's what a REM sleep rebound is. Now, if we look at that in the context of the mental health continuum, we can begin to see why, for example, firstly, why anxiety so often leads to depression. So let's say somebody is stressed from unmet needs. It's causing them worry, anxiety, making it difficult for them to go off to sleep and stay asleep. And as a result, they're losing REM sleep. They're not having so much. They're not getting as much as they need, less than 1.5 hours, certainly. And as a result, negative emotions are not discharged during REM sleep, and they carry over to the next waking phase. After some time of that, the brain's going to say, enough is enough. We need to prioritize REM sleep. It will trigger a rebound, bang, too much REM sleep. We go from not having enough to having much more than an hour and a half, maybe as much as 2 hours, maybe even as much as 3 or 4 hours REM sleep in a night. And as a result, the person wakes up exhausted, lacking in energy. They've lost motivation to address unmet needs, low in mood. In other words, the kinds of experiences that we would all recognize as depression. So that's why, if you sort of see that line as the mental health continuum, why stress from unmet needs can lead to anxiety, and that can cause insomnia, and then a rebound that tips a person from anxiety into depression. Of course, you'll all know that there are people whose anxiety and depression can sometimes come together hand in glove or fluctuate a little bit. That's not uncommon either. But at least there we can sort of see the role that sleep plays and why it's important to address sleep as well as addressing unmet needs. If we're thinking about post-traumatic stress, I've left the D in there, and I probably should put the D in brackets. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the debates and discussions going on around whether it's fair to call somebody affected by post-traumatic stress disordered when actually experiencing intrusive thoughts, memories, and flashbacks is a fairly normal reaction to exposure to distressing events that can give rise to a traumatic reaction. But bear with me for a moment. If we just consider the relationship between post-traumatic stress and depression, again, we've got a traumatic event that causes stress, then insomnia and nightmares will interrupt the REM sleep process and prevent those negative emotions from being discharged. And therefore, insomnia and nightmares get in the way of the person getting enough REM sleep, and those negative emotions will carry over to the next day. In suicide prevention research, it's for this reason that this is one explanation for why insomnia has been statistically found to be a risk factor for experiencing thoughts of suicide, and why nightmares can all sometimes predict attempts at suicide as well. There's a relationship there where REM sleep is prevented from discharging negative emotions, and they carry over to the next waking phase and fuel thoughts of suicide and fuel the motivation to act upon those thoughts as well. After a period of time, again, of somebody losing REM sleep to insomnia and nightmares, we'll see a rebound where the person has dreams much more than they would in a healthy sleep cycle. And again, the result is depression. So we can see why post-traumatic stress might put somebody at increased risk of depression because of the way that post-traumatic stress interacts with REM sleep. Okay, so I mentioned depressant substances before. So let's say somebody is stressed from unmet needs. It could be that one of those unmet needs is a need to feel safe. Maybe they're also affected by unpleasant thoughts or memories, flashbacks, intrusions, intrusive memories and thoughts and so on. Or it could be that they're just, they're struggling with another issue. Maybe they're very isolated and they feel extremely lonely, or they're worried about their finances, or they are a survivor of some form of abuse or neglect, whatever it might be. Maybe it's a combination of all of those factors. And at some point, they've become reliant upon using depressant substances to manage the stress from unmet needs. And those of you who have worked in substance misuse will know that when we say depressant substances, we don't mean substances that cause depression per se, but they depress the central nervous system. They calm people down, give people a measure of control over stress levels, arousal levels, anxiety, and so on and so forth. But all of those substances, alcohol, cannabis, opiates, by which I mean benzos, benzodiazepines, and diazepam, as well as heroin, they block REM sleep too. And it might be the person still dreaming to a certain degree. Maybe REM sleep is pushed into the final kind of part of the night. So the substances kind of anesthetize them, knock them out a little bit, sedate them, but maybe they then have a very intense episode of REM sleep once the effects of alcohol or cannabis or whatever it is worn off, and they wake up from very intense dreaming. That can happen too. But the overall effect of suppressing REM sleep stops it from doing the job of discharging negative emotions. And then the risk is that those persist. And if the person then is perhaps they're working with substance misuse, perhaps they're working with counselors or therapists in a local mind association or in the NHS, if one of their goals is reduction or abstinence, one of the things that we need to help the person prepare for is a rebound, because once you stop using those substances, the brain is like, oh, we can dream again now, we can trigger REM sleep. And then the person can have very vivid dreams, nightmares, and so on. And that can risk depression, but also relapse, going back to relying upon those substances to manage their overall level of arousal or to try and go off to sleep. So if I'm working with somebody who is tapering and trying to sort of, they want their overall goal is reduction or abstinence, and working one-to-one with somebody, then I'll almost certainly be doing work around addressing traumas, using trauma treatment techniques and so on. But I'll also be very aware that there'll be changes which affect their sleep as well, and I'll discuss that with them. It can help them to feel calmer if they kind of know that they may experience vivid dreams, so they're less likely to be taken by surprise by that, and then we can use it as a kind of measure as to whether or not them reducing their use of substances or abstaining from them completely, whether that's having some kind of overall effect and the degree to which they're able to cope with it. When we agree measures to promote better quality sleep and learn how to calm themselves down and bedtime routines and all that kind of a thing. And the same is also true of antidepressants, which suppress REM sleep. So that will include things that basically act upon serotonin. So serotonin's role, if you're thinking about something like 5 to 10% of our serotonin is produced by a group of neurons called the RAFE nuclei, and they're in our brainstem, and they trigger the release of serotonin molecules along rivers in our brain. And one of their functions is to put the brakes on strong emotions. They sort of inhibit and dampen down emotions to keep us on an even keel. But their rather major function is to inhibit REM sleep. They kind of switch REM sleep off by interacting with other neurotransmitters in the brain. So SSRIs, SNRIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, tricyclics supposedly less frequently prescribed nowadays, but you still meet people who've been given tricyclics. All of those act on serotonin, not to increase levels of serotonin, because it's a myth that some people have low levels of serotonin in their brain, but to prolong the activity of serotonin. And in doing so, it will inhibit REM sleep. And that can give people alleviation from some of the symptoms that we spoke about before. So if someone's been dreaming excessively, they're waking up exhausted, and their brain's burnt off loads of glucose energy, then putting the brakes on REM sleep with antidepressants that act on serotonin can give them some relief from that. There can also be risk of side effects too, and it might be that by suppressing REM sleep, it stops REM sleep doing the job of discharging anxiety. So some anxious feelings might persist. That's one of the side effects. If you've heard that lots of serotonin is produced in your gut and that it's a kind of the gut's happy hormone, that's not true. Serotonin has a different role in the gut. If you increase serotonin activity in the gut, it will strip your stomach lining and trigger diarrhea, which is why diarrhea is a side effect of antidepressants. So that kind of serotonin and happy gut myth is kind of is like a hangover from the older idea that serotonin was a happiness hormone. In actual fact, unless you enjoy diarrhea, I can't imagine that any of you do. It's not going to make you happy, basically. Anyway, nonetheless, if somebody's coming off antidepressants, we need to support them and prepare for that. And usually, you'd hope that it's a kind of a planned process so that you don't get a huge rebound effect where all of a sudden antidepressants are removed from the equation. We see a rebound and too much REM sleep and the person relapses into depression. Another place where you see REM sleep rebound is in bipolar and cyclothymia. So again, sort of stress from unmet needs. You might see a manic phase, hypermania, and then if that persists over time, kind of euphoria. Could be that the person is staying up later at night pursuing kind of creative activities that meet their need for meaning and purpose, or maybe they've got a new idea for setting up a business or whatever it might be. And as a result, they're not getting enough REM sleep because they're not sleeping enough. And the consequence of that is that they're not getting enough REM sleep, is that those emotions carry over. So there's an increasing emotional arousal. And then after a period of time, a rebound, and the brain says, right, enough of that. You've been staying up too late. We need to prioritize REM sleep. And then the person crashes into depression, which is, a pattern I'm sure many of you would have seen, perhaps in yourselves, but in others too. Historically, sometimes this would get missed and people wouldn't get diagnosed with bipolar perhaps until they're into their late 20s. If they'd gone to see the GP during a period of depression, they'd be prescribed antidepressants. If they'd been picked up during a particularly severe manic phase, and maybe they were prescribed antipsychotics. Nowadays, when it's picked up, people are prescribed lamotrigine. And that's interesting to me. Because I'm obsessed with REM sleep, and lamotrigine's effect is the opposite of antidepressants. Lamotrigine increases REM sleep. So that might be prescribed to somebody to prevent the manic phase tipping them into depression. In other words, lamotrigine will encourage REM sleep. So they might wake up feeling a bit exhausted and groggy from dreaming lots, but they're getting enough REM sleep to prevent that rebound that tips them into a very severe depression. The other group of people that might be prescribed lamotrigine are people with epilepsy. So I have very mild epilepsy. I've had one big tonic-clonic seizure, and I have very mild seizures where I don't lose consciousness or awareness. I'm aware that it's happening. So I kind of, as I say, it's super mild. And I know people that have like 2 big tonic-clonic seizures a day. But following my big tonic-clonic seizure, I was sort of admitted into hospital and they wanted to prescribe me lamotrigine. And I thought there must be some connection with REM sleep. So I'd had 4 nights where I'd woken up too early at like 2 in the morning, not being able to go back to sleep. So I argued that lamotrigine wasn't the solution. The solution was for me to sleep in, and that my employer, as a mental health charity, would encourage me to do that. So I get enough sleep in the morning to reduce the risk of me having seizures. And that works for me because a seizure is where there's too much electrochemical activity in the brain, and the brain just wipes it out with a seizure. REM sleep performs the same function. When it's acting out our emotional expectations from the waking phase, it's discharging all of the electrochemical activity that comes with emotions. So basically, it calms my brain down, and REM sleep's better for doing that than seizures, I would argue. That's what lamotrigine does anyway. If you meet people who've been prescribed that, it's increasing REM sleep to prevent mania tipping them into depression. Okay, I'll pause there. Any questions about that? Probably given people enough to think about, and you'll all want answers to Kerry's question about interventions, I think. How are we doing time-wise, Sarah? We're about halfway through, is that right?
Yeah, we're okay for time.
Great. Is there such a thing as too much sleep? Well, the answer to that question, I think, is how we feel when we wake up. So if we're feeling exhausted, then we probably slept too much. There's also some research around dementia as well, which shows that you need the right balance. Too little sleep, if we're not getting enough REM sleep and not enough deep sleep, so not enough deep sleep to repair cells, not enough REM sleep to discharge emotions, and that's a risk factor for forms of dementia. Equally, if we're sleeping too long, then that can be a risk factor for dementia too. I can see that a couple of people are typing questions in the chat, so I'll wait for them. Kerry, really good question again, Kerry. What's the recommended sleep for adults? I haven't looked it up since I was younger and no longer fit that category. Okay, so the kind of guideline is between 7 and 8 hours. Because sleep cycles run in 90 minutes, I suspect that the median average is about 7.5, because you can divide that by 90-minute cycles, and I think you get 5 if my maths is correct. In the later stages of our life, it reduces to 6 hours. And I don't know that anybody really knows why that is. It might be that we need less deep sleep to repair the body's cells, because our body is kind of gradually kind of aging, and so we don't need to be fit enough to run marathons unless you do, and so it changes. It can reduce down to about 6 hours. I'm sure you know that teenagers and adolescents usually need something like 10 to 12, and infants much more. But again, it can vary from person to person. Historically, there have been people who claim they could get by on 4 hours sleep. But, we don't know what the consequences and the side effects of that may have been. I mean, a famous example is Margaret Thatcher, who got a huge amount done while she was alive, but then developed dementia in the later stages of her life. So there may be a cost to not getting enough sleep. And again, I think the best measure is how we feel when we wake up in the morning. Heather, I have to remain politically neutral. I probably don't actually, given that I'm addressing a local mind association network, but there may be some quiet conservatives amongst you, so I'll respect that too. Any other questions or comments? Okay, I'm sure you're all dying to hear about what we can do about all of this, because you're probably the kinds of people that want solutions as well. So I'll return to my slides. Okay. So interventions, what do we need to do? So there are kind of it says 7 things, but really, it's kind of 4.5. But the first thing is always that we need to, in any kind of intervention, I would argue that we need to be looking at addressing unmet needs. And nowadays, if you just cast your mind back a bit, a little bit like when I was speaking about REM sleep earlier on, nobody had heard of it 15, 20 years ago unless they were a sleep researcher. Once upon a time, we were very much focused on the symptoms and managing the symptoms of people's mental ill health. But over the last 20 years or so, the conversation has shifted, and now we recognize that needs are really, the most, perhaps the most important thing. I think that the lockdown response to COVID accelerated our understanding because, mental ill health doubled during lockdown, and I'm sure you weren't surprised. You could have predicted that would happen if you're working in mental health, because people need to feel that they have a sense of control over their lives. They need to feel safe. They need to feel that they have purpose and meaning in their lives. They need to feel connected to other human beings, to the wider community, and to have at least one relationship that they can rely upon when the chips are down. Whether that's a partner or a sibling, or if it's a child, a parent that they can turn to when times are tough. For some people, it's a pet, and there's even some research from lockdown that shows that having a houseplant that you could look after made a huge difference to people's mental health and well-being. Within needs, I'd include physical needs for a healthy diet and movement, but also sleep. So key intervention is to look at both the quantity and quality of a person's sleep. Now, if somebody is stressed, anxious, worried about unmet needs, then that can be a barrier to them getting off to sleep and staying asleep. So it might also be that, as well as agreeing goals around addressing unmet needs, we also need to help them to learn, or if we're talking about ourselves, make sure that we're learning and practicing techniques to reduce arousal. Different things work for different people. For some people, it can be breathing exercises. For others, it's grounding techniques. For some people, it might be doing exercise a couple of hours before, but not right before you go to sleep, because that will rev your heart rate up. But during the day, to kind of burn off cortisol, stress hormones, and release in endogenous cannabinoids and so on, and the other feel-good hormones. For others, it might be acceptance and commitment therapy techniques, or learning how to reframe negative thoughts, or journaling, whatever it might be. But the second part has to be about reducing arousal, particularly in the run-up to bedtime. The third thing to keep in mind is tapering as well. If somebody's been relying upon painkillers or maybe antidepressants, and they're planning to reduce their usage, then they need to be supported to do that gradually, so that they don't have a sudden rebound of the return of REM sleep that causes vivid dreaming and exhausts their brain, and so on and so forth. And then the fourth part is really about body clocks. So earlier on, I think it was either Kerry or Christine asked a question in the chat about what happens if somebody doesn't feel sleepy or doesn't go to bed at 2 o'clock in the morning. We by and large, our body clocks are synchronized by sunlight, and hormones will be released in response to sunlight, things like melatonin, and then other hormones, or things like cortisol, will be released to kind of wake us up slowly in the morning, and then they'll progressively lift and drop off in anticipation of going off to sleep. So to support synchronizing our body clocks, this is where 5, 6, and 7 come in. So my current mantra is a good night's sleep starts first thing in the morning. If assuming we're not doing night shifts, when we get up in the morning, it's really important to be exposed to blue light frequencies that appear over the horizon as the sun comes up. And the reason for that is that in the retinas of our eyes, there are recently discovered receptors called photoganglion receptors. You don't need to remember that name, but all you need to remember is that your eyes need to see blue light early in the morning to reset your body clock. And that time stamps your body clock for the rest of the day. If your body knows that we're resetting the body clock now, whatever time it is, 7 o'clock in the morning, that then allows your body clock to synchronize everything else that will happen within the next 24 hours, including when you feel hungry, when you feel a bit sleepy and fancy a nap, when you feel the need to go to the toilet, and when you feel sleepy in the evening as well. And having a regular getting up time is the number one most important thing, I would argue, to giving you a good chance, giving you a chance of the rest of the day working out well and setting you up for a good night's sleep. Now, if somebody's struggling with depression, that's a big ask, because just getting out of bed is hugely challenging, let alone getting up to go to work or to get to college to study or whatever it might be. So I usually break that down into really manageable steps. So it could be that when somebody wakes up, the only thing they have to do, the first task is just to put one foot out of the bed and onto the floor, and then the second leg once they've done that. And then if they can put both feet on the floor, then sit up. And then if they can get to the kitchen to put the kettle on, and then get to a window where there's sunlight. Or if it's easier, just get to the window first and just look out the window, and so that they can see some kind of blue light, and that sets their body clock. So the body clock is like, okay, now is waking up time. And it'll trigger the release of cortisol and what have you. Not severe kind of stressy levels of cortisol, but just gentle levels to alert them and wake them up and give them the motivation to take their next steps, to whatever that might be, whether that's making themselves a cup of tea or coffee to sit down by a window or in a garden if they're lucky enough to have one, or to wash their face, brush their teeth, whatever it might be. Just that morning routine, getting that in place and making sure that that's regular sets everything else up. And then during the daytime, things to consider. One of them we've already talked about a bit, which is napping. We don't want to nap so much that it reduces our appetite for sleep. If you hear the jargon term sleep drive, that's what that means. It's your appetite for sleepiness, which is different from being tired and exhausted. It's a different kind of quality, really. So if you're napping in the afternoon, you feel that was great, but then you find it difficult to go off to bed at a reasonable hour, then napping is not so helpful. Another thing to think about is, although it's most of the time we can metabolize caffeine sufficiently well for it not to be a problem for sleep, maybe having a cut-off point if you've done everything else and you're still struggling to get to sleep, and sort of saying, I'm not going to have any caffeinated drinks after 3 o'clock or after midday or whatever it is, whatever works for you. And then that leads us to the bedtime routine. And really important things around bedtime routines are things like having an evening meal and a warm bath and shower. Like both of those are rounds, whether one comes before the other, a couple of hours before you go off to sleep. And the reason for that is that if it warms the body up, once you get out of the shower or get out of the bath, the body will begin to cool down, and that will trigger sleepiness and sleepy hormones. You don't want to eat too soon before you go to sleep, again, because it will warm the body up too much. You want the body's temperature to drop slightly, and that prepares us to go off to sleep. Other parts of a bedtime routine are things like having a cut-off time for screens that emit light and mess up our body clock. If you remember, the morning routine uses light to establish our body clock's routine. So if we're looking at lots of bright lights, then we're going to screw with that in the evening, and we need to avoid doing that. So cutting off screens and lights at a sensible time, maybe an hour and a half before going to bed. And then making sure that the room is sufficiently dark. Could be blackout curtains, could be eye masks, whatever it is that works for you, and also that the room is cool enough. All of that REM sleep activity increases heat in the brain, and to keep the brain cool enough so it doesn't overheat, our arteries in our neck have to carry the heat into our body and then release it into the room. And for that to happen, the room has to be cooler, so the heat will leave our head, to move into our body, and then leave our body to move into the bedroom, and through an open window or whatever it is. If we're thinking about changes in our lives, like menopause, for example, if heat can't leave the brain to enter the body, and it can't leave the body to enter the room, then people might wake up from hot flushes. So making sure that the room is cool enough, maybe having cold water flannels, that kind of a thing, to kind of cool your head and your neck as well, to allow heat to leave the brain, can also support people get a decent amount of sleep during what can be a really challenging time of life for some people. So those are my kind of 4.5, 7 really, aren't they? But call them 4.5 recommendations for what we can do. Okay, questions and observations. Bedtime shower people terrify me. Stay away from them then, Heather. I can see somebody's typing. I'm intrigued to know what your suggested interventions might be to restore a healthy sleep routine for a manic or hypermanic person, especially when sleep drive is low, non-existent. Is it the same as this list? I think that's a really good question, and it's a really difficult thing to manage. I know that some of my colleagues working in our supported housing projects at Suffolk Mind have been able to work with people who live with very severe bipolar to keep regular sleep habits in place. So those are the last 3 things I spoke about, like a morning routine, avoiding too much caffeine or other stimulants during the day, and protecting the evening routine as well. And that can head off the beginning of the manic or hypermanic phases. I think once it's past a certain threshold, tricky to deal with, tricky to address, Raphael. So I don't want to make light of that at all. But I do know that the people living in our supported housing projects, when they're supported to keep sleep in place, have had some success at preventing manic or hypermanic phases, sort of going beyond a certain threshold. Thank you for that question too, Raphael. I think it's a really important one. Thank you, Jinder. Any further questions? I've got some more questions for you if you haven't, so don't go anywhere just yet. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. So at the beginning, actually I've got an entire other topic to talk about. This is the most exciting bit. Definitely don't leave. What do dreams tell us about unmet needs? Okay, so this is a little bit more esoteric than the sciencey stuff about REM sleep, but I think nonetheless just as valuable. And I'm going to share sort of 4 case studies with you, which I think really illustrate what I spoke about earlier on, which is that the emotions and metaphors of our dreams match our waking concerns, particularly as REM sleep is trying to discharge emotions that we've not been able to act upon during the day. So if I share a few case studies with you. So one of them comes from a lady who was coming to see a therapist, and during therapy she shared a dream that she'd been having where she was trapped in the Battle of Hastings, which many of us learn about at school, 1066, and she was being chased by Norman soldiers. And this is a recurring dream. And with the therapist, they explored what might be giving rise to this dream. Now, one of the things that had brought her to therapy was workplace stress. And one of the factors that was contributing to stress in the workplace was that there was a guy who'd asked her out a few times, and she said no, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. And she would go to make herself a drink in the kitchen, and he'd kind of appear and ask, when are you going to come out with me? Or she'd be at the photocopier, and there he was. And when the therapist asked more questions about this man and what he was like, it turned out that his name was Norman. So I hope you can see that if you were persistently being pursued by a man called Norman and your brain was making associations with what you already knew about the Normans, then it might use the metaphor of the Battle of Hastings 1066 to kind of act out and try and discharge those waking concerns. And the fact that it's a recurring dream tells us that it's an ongoing issue which needs to be addressed. I've got a couple of other examples of recurring dreams. Another one comes from when I was delivering some training, face-to-face training at a mental health charity, a session called The Essentials, where I also talk about some of the things that we've spoken about today, although not in as much depth. The focus is more on needs. And people had just come back for a break, and I'd been talking about sleep and depression, and I invited questions. And somebody shared a recurring dream that they'd been having. And in this recurring dream, they were back on a train commuting to work, as they had done 20 years before when they used to work in the city. And they asked me why had I been having this recurring dream? And I said, well, can you tell me what was going on around about the time of the recurring dream? When did it start? And they thought for a moment, and they said, well, it was not long after I'd actually retired, so I wasn't working anymore. I said, I see. I said, so is it possible that as a result of retiring, your need to have some control and structure over your day wasn't so well met, and your need for meaning and purpose, perhaps, you were still figuring out ways to meet the need for meaning and purpose, and maybe you were a bit restless too, and as a result, the brain was trying to discharge the emotions from those unmet needs by dreaming about being back on the train and commuting to work as you had done 20 years before. And they said, yeah, that makes sense. And I said, and are you still having those dreams now? And they said, no, they stopped a little while ago. And I said, what happened? What was going on around the time that those dreams stopped? And they said, well, I think they stopped when I started volunteering for the charity that this person was volunteering at. And I said, so is it possible that when you started volunteering, then you were getting those needs met again, and there was no need for you to dream about them at night? And they agreed that made sense to them. Now, another example of a recurring dream was shared with me by somebody who'd been referred to Suffolk Mines Counselling Services for trauma treatment because they had a number of experiences which were still affecting them in the present, things that are worrying and bothering them, intrusive thoughts, memories, and flashbacks. It struck me that this person, although they'd been referred for trauma treatment, that it wasn't really kind of at the top of their priority list, and we should always be guided by what's important to the person. I'm sure you'll agree. And they shared a recurring dream that they'd been having. And in this dream, they had been walking barefoot along a road, and it was tarmac, and the tarmac was sticky, and they described it as being like wading through treacle. When I found out a bit more about what was going on with this person and the different concerns in their life, during lockdown, they'd developed an online gambling addiction, and as a result, their finances were in complete disarray. They had to sign up to a debt management plan, and as part of that plan, they had to give up having a car. And that meant that without a car, they were worried about how they were going to be able to drive in order to meet their partner who lived some way away, and how they were going to stay connected with their family because their family were a bit scattered over the UK. And so I suggested that the recurring dream, because it was going on over a period of time, was really the brain trying to discharge their worries about losing their independence, having no control over being able to travel distances with their car, and that the wading through the tar on the road was a metaphor for that, for not being able to move about freely and independently, and also feeling trapped and worried about their finances and not having any control over that too, because they've been compelled to sign up to a debt management plan. So I hope that you can see how in those three instances, a person's dreams were the metaphors of their dreams, and the emotions that came with them were a match for their waking concerns. And then the fourth case study I want to share with you. This isn't a recurring dream; it was a one-off dream, and it came from a woman who was a very successful project manager. She'd established a number of services within a business. And in this dream, she was renovating her house, which she actually was in real life, in waking life. And a colleague of hers from a service that she'd set up before came to the door and presented her with a designer handbag. When the colleague had left, she'd thrown the designer handbag into the skip outside the house that she was renovating. This is in the dream. And she said, I can't make head or tail of this. I don't understand why I would throw. I said, how did you feel about the designer handbag in the dream? And she said, oh, well, I really liked it. And that's why it's so strange that I chucked it in the skip, because I actually quite, I felt really drawn and attached to this designer handbag. And I said to her, so the colleague that presented you with the bag, you worked with them before on developing a service? And she said, yes. And I said, and how do you feel about that service? And she said, well, I'm very proud of the work that we did. And, I learned a lot by designing that particular service, but it's just not my bag anymore. And at that moment, she had a penny drop moment, and she could see, that's what it is. I designed that service, but it's just not my bag anymore. In the dream, the designer handbag was a metaphor for the service that she wanted to let go of to move on to new projects, but she was continually being pulled back in by former colleagues who didn't feel that they could act independently and take responsibility for things without her being involved in that particular service. So I've now got some questions for you just to consider. You can ask me questions about any of those 4 case studies if you like, but if you've had unusual or recurring dreams, looking in first of all, have you had any? And if you have, can you see how the metaphors of those dreams reflect waking concerns? And if you're comfortable to do so, do share them in the chat or in the Q&A function. And I'll stop sharing now. Even working out, if I eat something bad, I instantly think, yeah, and that's terrible. Yeah. So I can see that Heather's typing. Don't leave Heather to ask all the questions.
I just love the sound of my own voice, I guess. I can do some talking if we'd rather do it that way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, by all means, I'm happy for people to unmute and ask rather than type.
It felt quicker. I realised quite how much I was typing. Hi, thanks for this. I've only had one reoccurring dream that's ever really stuck with me, and I'm sort of trying to place it within the lens that you're using to describe how they mean, what the sort of, meaning behind them, I guess. At the time, I was moving out of London towards Bristol, which is where I am these days. And I'm trying to sort of like find my place here. But the dream was I was getting tattoos. I'm not tattooed at all. I'm not really someone who does much body decoration. But tattoos on my upper arms of a sparrow and a robin sat in a bramble. And like they've got a little bit of like battle damage to them, but they're singing. And I like to think that with this lens anyway, it puts a little bit of a representation on like growing out of a like different world, moving into a different one, taking the knocks of how hard the thing was at the time, but finding joy in what was happening.
Yeah, I mean, if you'd be better placed to answer it than me, but did you have to untangle yourself lots in the move from what was going on in London and your situation there, or was it a fairly clean break?
No, I think that's a fair outline. Like, yeah, I'd lived in London 22, 23 years.
Okay, right. So that's you did you have lots of kind of connections and with people in London and things that you needed to kind of resolve or kind of let go of before you made the
very
move?
much so, very much
Very
so.
much so. Okay, so possibly the brambles are a metaphor for the kind of entanglements that we need to untangle ourselves from in any kind of complex move from one location to another or from one job to another. They were tattoos on your forearms, you say, and this is a recurring dream over a period of time.
Yeah, I had it sort of 4 or 5 times.
Okay, all right. And did the dream stop at kind of a particular milestone?
Honestly, I think they stopped when I started telling people I was having recurring dreams.
Did they? Okay, all right. So maybe part of the process was expressing how you felt about the move, and once you'd sort of said it out loud, I don't know whether you felt listened to by other people or understood, or maybe you were sort of telling the people who were you speaking to about how you felt? Were they people who were involved in the entanglements?
I mean, every friendship you've got somewhere you're leaving is going to be involved in that
Yeah,
entanglement to some extent.
yeah, absolutely. Um, did you feel, and how did you feel once what were your expectations about moving to Brighton? Did you feel that you were going to be freer and that it was a fresh start, or that were there particular things you were looking forward to?
It's Bristol, but yeah, yes.
Sorry,
Like, so I was
Bristol.
moving up this way because this is where my partner lives. Um,
Ah, okay.
so yeah, like I suppose actually now I'm saying it out loud, the line of there's two birds there.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Did you say a sparrow and a robin?
Yeah,
Right, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean,
he's not
it,
called Robin though. I'll tell you that for nothing.
okay. They're not called sparrow either, presumably.
No.
No, okay, but okay. Well, does that make sense to you when you kind of think through the metaphors of the dream in the context of what you were resolving at the time?
Yeah, I think to some extent, like it's a little bit isolated from me now, a few years down the line. But yeah, no,
Mm,
I like the lens.
wonderful, good. I'm glad that that makes sense to you. That's fantastic, and thank you very much for sharing that too, Heather.
I just like the sound of my own voice, as I say.
You have a nice voice. Anybody else? Do put your hands up, and you can speak if it's quicker than typing. Okay, if not, I've got a question for you. So I'll share my screen again, just briefly. Okay. So at the beginning, I asked you about whether or not you asked people directly about sleep or whether you listened out for sleep issues. And so asking you sort of a version of the same question. When you are supporting someone, as a result of what we've spoken about this afternoon and what I've shared with you, will you A, ask them about sleep directly, B, listen out for sleep issues, or C, something else completely different? Again, answers in the chat. You can break the rules and type something or say something too if you like. I'll leave that up there just for a moment for you to think about it before I stop sharing. Okay. Ah, right. Oh, we've had some other questions since then. This is from Raphael. I often have recurring dreams about sitting exams and not having prepared at all, not realizing the exam is happening until I get into school, or forgetting my ingredients for food tech. All of these dreams have only happened since completing school. This is so common. I've done a number of groups and workshops with people, and very often now I don't want to jump to conclusions, Raphael, but very often people that find themselves in situations, perhaps in the workplace, where they're suddenly asked questions that they didn't know that they didn't know they would have to ask, or they're asked for a report, or they're worried that they've forgotten a particular detail in a report, or maybe that they've turned up to work without something that they really needed, or maybe it's a meeting or a presentation you have to give, or whatever it might be. We got a thumbs up from Raphael. Yeah, this is super common. The school exam dream is, but when it's recurring, often happens as a result of people being in environments where they feel that they're being tested and they don't have all of the available information or answers. And Kerry says, "Oh my God, the not having a revised dream is real." It absolutely is. This is super common. And then in answer to the question, lots of A's and B's, which I think, I've got to remember my own slides now. I think that means that you were going to ask people about sleep directly when what's your sleep like, which is all you really need to ask just to begin the conversation. Okay. That's fantastic. Well, I only really have one more thing to say to you all, which is thank you so much for joining this afternoon and for staying awake. I assume you've had your cameras off, so some of you may have nodded off, I don't know. But thank you for engaging and for your questions as well. I hope you found it useful and that you get a good night's sleep tonight and going forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kerry.